Hey and welcome to episode 4 of Battle Games in Middle-earth. In this series we're going to be visiting the 91 magazines released by Games Workshop in the early 2000s. In this week's episode of Painting Workshop we're going to be painting up the 10 Uruk-Hai that came with the magazine. We'll be adding to our collection of terrain by building a hill in Modelling Workshop along with 3D printing out some rocks that we can use on our battlefield. In the battle game we have the 10 Uruk-Hai who are trying to reach Rohan, but Elrond has dispatched a company of elves to try and stop them. Can the Uruk-Hai break through the elven defences and reach Rohan? Or will the elves stop the Uruk-Hai, giving Rohan the much needed time to reach Helm's Deep? So let's get going, and with our first look in the magazine with the 90-second flip. In this week's painting workshop we're going to be tackling the 10 Uruk-Hai warriors that came with the magazine. I actually have 20 of these Uruk-Hai warriors already in my pile of shame that I've not quite got around to. Now this additional 10 means that I've got 30. With now owning 30 of these Uruk-Hai I'm going to be using pre-mixed paint so that I can repeat the recipe later on once I get around to finally painting that 20 from my pile of shame. Here's what we're going to use today. For the metals, Leadbelcher and Stormhost Silver, Nuln Oil, Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camo Shade. For the flesh, Rakarth Flesh, Model Air Mahogany. A good GW alternative is probably Doombull Brown. Model Air Mud Brown. A good GW alternative is probably Baneblade Brown. And Caribou Crimson for a wash. For the leathers and the cloth, Rhinox Hide, Baneblade Brown and Gorthor Brown. For the hair and the black leather, Contrast Black Legion, Skaven Blight Dinge. For basing, I'm going to be using a pot of Sterling Mud from Games Workshop. And with that, let's get started painting. As usual, a quick prime using Black Vallejo Surface Primer. The majority of the model is metal armour. Let's start off by using a dry brush technique with Leadbelcher as a base. Now apply a few coats of washes, starting with a wash of Nuln Oil, followed by a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camo Shade, roughly 75-25%. With a light dry brush of Leadbelcher just hitting the edges, followed with an even lighter brush of Stormhost Silver. Using Model Air Mahogany for the flesh of the Uruk-Hai is a bit thin to cover over the black, so first apply 2 thin coats of Rakarth Flesh as a base. Using Model Air Mahogany gives a deep, rich red shade. Model Air paints are very thin when applied with a brush, so a couple of coats are needed. We'll be highlighting up with some Model Air Mud Brown. If you take a close look at the Uruk-Hai skin, you can see they are patchy shades of reds and browns, so I'm using a stippling technique to recreate that effect, and stippling over and over, constantly moving around the model. As a final highlight, stipple on some Rakarth Flesh. To bring back some of the red shades to the skin, a wash of Caribou Crimson is applied. For the leathers, let's apply a base of Rhinox Hide. Using short, quick strokes, we layer up with some Gorthor Brown. For the blacks I'm using Contrast Black Legion. I also decided to go with black gloves for my Uruk-Hai. Stepping back and taking a look at the model, I wasn't happy with the armour, it was a bit too shiny, so I dulled it down with some Agrax Earthshade. Add some Rakarth Flesh for the teeth, Highlight up the hair and gloves with some Scathe and Blight Dinge. Onto basing, and I've had this pot of sterling mud for a while and never really used it, so I figured now's as good a time as any. I give each model a quick coat and apply some graft tusk and a little pigment powder. In this magazine we're building a hill to use on our battlefield. Hills offer us some nice height to use on the battlefield. Often when we set up our battlefields they can be very flat. Of course we can play on a flat, featureless battlefield, but it's not very interesting. As you'll see shortly, they're quick and easy to make, we don't need much, and it's an easy project to get started on. Some glue. I pretty much use Mod Podge all the time. For this one I'm using some sawdust floss, but you can use static grass. A knife, or I actually bought a foam cutter, which is really handy when working with expanded polystyrene. A marker to draw out our rough shape, some green paint, any shade will do really. I also grab a few rocks from the garden, and some expanded polystyrene. You can use XPS foam, but that seems to be extremely difficult to get here in the UK. In fact, if you know where to get it, message it in the comments below. To get started on the hill, first mark out a rough shape of an oval on your foam. Next, cut it out. A craft knife will work, or as you can see here I'm using a hot wire cutter, which reduces the mess quite considerably when working with expanded polystyrene. It's a bit too thick, so cut the edges down to an angle. Once that's done, I make some small adjustments so that models can stand on the hill and walk up it. Next, paint the foam. I'm using flat green, but really any green will do. Most of it will be covered shortly. Also, no need to use an airbrush, but I have one, so I'm going to use it. Water down some Mod Podge, roughly 2 to 1 with water, and spread it all over your hill. Grab whatever flock you want and just sprinkle it all over. I'm using sawdust flock. I leave it on for about 3 minutes to give it time to soak in, and then turn it upside down to knock off the excess. I found some nicely shaped rocks in the garden and arranged them how I wanted. They really didn't want to stick together, but I used super glue gel as it's a bit thicker, and I held it in place for 30 seconds and they stuck. Give them a quick undercoat. And dry brush with grey. I'm using stone grey here. I chose not to glue the rocks down to the hill so that I can switch them out for other items in the future. And there we have it, a simple hill ready to use on our battlefield. In this week's episode, we're playing out a scenario where Uruk-Hai are attempting to smash through the defences sent by Elrond, hoping to delay them so that they can't reach the Rohan. Hopefully it'll buy Rohan a little bit of time so they can get to Helm's Deep. Let's see what happens. Forces of good, we have 8 Elven warriors, 4 with bow and 4 with sword. The forces of evil are comprised of 10 Uruk-Hai, 5 with sword and shield and 5 with a pike. Gaming area starts with the forces of evil on the western edge of the board, and the forces of good spread out over the east. For good to win, they need to kill 6 of the Uruk-Hai, and for evil to win, they need 5 Uruk-Hai to break through the defences and off the eastern side of the board. The forces of good have priority. I love that magazine. Painting up the Uruk-Hai was a real treat. They're definitely my favourite of the evil forces. Our battle games are looking better with the additional terrain that we built in this episode, and they're really starting to come together, and it was a really fun scenario to play out in this episode. If you haven't already done it, consider supporting the Fellowship by liking, commenting and subscribing. If you want to support the channel further, consider supporting me on Patreon. If you go over there, you'll be able to download all the terrain files that we've created in Modelling Workshop throughout all the episodes of the magazine. Join me in the next episode where we get to paint up Lurtz. I'll take you on a tour of my Farmer Maggot's game board, along with about 15 STL files for us to download and add to our terrain collection. And in the battle game, the evil forces ambush Frodo and his companions.